Primary method for diagnosis is the molecular test using the RT-PCR.
مظبوطش. استنى
So again,
ما
all this
بقدرش
has
افصل
been
هاي
published
صح.
in much more detail. We talked about
روح
also in
الصورة
the guideline about
هسه.
positive, what do you
يعني هسه
call
إذا
it,
فصلت
a
هسه
positive
لا
result,
بتروح
a
الصورة.
negative
أنا
result,
لازم
in some cases indeterminate
أعطيني اللينك.
result. Now, positive result is usually found when there is viral RNA present and it's detected in the sample, and this usually indicates active infection. Although
احنا
there
كانت
are
محلول
some
امبارح
cases
كل شيء
where
تمام. مش
viral
عارف
may
اليوم
not
شو
be
الجو.
detected, but the
طب ليش ما
patient
اطلع لايف
may
من
not
صفحتي
be
الآن؟ يا ما
infectious
اطلع من وين ما
because
بدك مشان الله اطلع من
maybe
طيزة
they are
إذا
at
ست
a stage
مشان
of
الله.
infection.
إذا أحمد مالك يا عماني بساعد فيك.
So there
فين
is
شغلة
some
طردك هالكي؟
controversy as to
اطلع
whether
من وين ما كان
detection of
اطلع
RNA
مصطفى.
is always indicator of infectiousness. That is why antigen testing can sometimes be
طب
helpful
هسه
in
خلينا
the sense
نودي له
that
اللينك وبعدين
RNA
احنا
may
لايفين
be
فيسبوك طالعين
present, but the
100% على
viral
الفيسبوك على اليوتيوب.
particles may not be
طيب اعطيني
active,
اللينك.
whereas antigen testing can tell you perhaps more correctly
ليش في ماي
presence of live infection or live virus. So there is controversy in this area, but in most cases, RNA detection of RNA indicates presence of the virus and active infection. Negative results usually should be depending on patient's condition, whether there is symptoms present, then perhaps the test may need to be repeated because there is a significant percentage. I think it's been reported up to 30% false negative testing for some of the PCR assays. So repeat testing might be necessary. This is also true when there is the result is indeterminate, so repeat testing is
طب هو
recommended.
سامع من وين؟
So that
خلاص
there's a lot
ما
of
حدا يحكي
detail in
حوالي.
the guidelines. I'd love to visit the article on the IFCC website or CCLM website. We also
أعطيني
have
لينك
published
المقطع خليه من بسطوني.
guidelines on serological testing, antibody testing, and talked about clinical indications for testing, assay selection, assay verification, and how to interpret serological assays and some of their limitations. So the primary targets of these assays are IgG and IgM, and although most of the recent assays are focused more on, especially the quantitative assays are focused on IgG, but both assays have been well studied, and a number of kits are available on the market, and many of them have been actually approved for clinical use. Some of them, I'm sure, are being used in your own lab currently. Typically, they either target nucleocapsid, so IgG raised against the nucleocapsid, or a spike protein, or IgM antibodies against these targets. And this diagram again shows some of the key proteins that can be targeted by these antibodies, and measurement of those antibodies can be as the basis of the serological assays. Now, in the guideline, we talk about the clinical applications. So again, we emphasize that it should not be used as a diagnosis or diagnostic assay. So the evidence does not support the use of serological assays to diagnose infection, but it can be used as an adjunct to molecular testing in patients presenting with suggestive clinical features. For example, sometimes the early infection phase has passed, and the RNA test might be, the PCR test might be negative, but the serological assay could be helpful in assessing whether there was exposure to the viral particle, to the viral proteins. And therefore, it can be used in a number of other scenarios. For example, to serve as an adjunct to molecular test, where persistently positive molecular tests occur in the absence of an infectious virus. Um, Also, in conditions such as in children with MIS-C or multi-inflammatory
ولازم
syndrome,
استنينا شوي
which
تخلص هذا وهي
actually I
تطلع
talked
اللايف زي
about in
امبارح
another
بالضبط كنا. طيب
presentation,
هسه احنا شغل لي هاي
where
وابعدوا من
children
حواليها، خلي
develop
اللي
this
قاعدين بلكوا
significant
حكي يسكتوا.
hyperinflammation
يلا تعال.
weeks after
بس
being exposed to the
بس
virus.
انت ماخذ كل الصوت من المايك.
So
طيب
serology
بس
can be
مبدئيا
useful.
يعني
A number of other
مبدئيا
future
بالضبط.
indications have been discussed as well that I will leave for you to review in the publication. We also talk about how to interpret serological testing. Positive results, what positive result actually mean, what is a negative result, and how to follow up, as well as indeterminate results. Again, antibodies usually when the antibody test is positive, usually this indicates the presence of viral protein. Now the viral protein may suggest exposure to virus has occurred. Now that doesn't mean necessarily current exposure, it may have been past exposure. So that is important. And it's important to interpret within the clinical context of the patient. A negative result is usually indicated that there is no antibody present against the viral proteins, but again, follow-up testing is usually recommended if there is significant suspicion of past exposure or current exposure. Again, indeterminate results need to be followed up as well. Now we talk about, very importantly, how to actually analytically and clinically verify each assay. So there have been hundreds of assays developed. So before one uses it in patients for monitoring in public health or any other scenario, detailed verification is important, both analytical and clinical. So in the publication, we talk about looking at some of the key parameters such as imprecision, carryover, cross-reactivity, interference. We also talk about clinical performance specifications, assessing clinical sensitivity, clinical specificity. And some of the key components that are important to take into account are listed here and are discussed in detail in the publication. The patient setting is really important, whether it's inpatient, outpatient, as well as severity of the disease should be taken into account when interpreting the results and also when evaluating the assay. Timing of assessment, as well as use of reference comparators, known versus unknown exposure samples that can be used to verify and validate the assay. Of course, external quality assurance is important, and fortunately now there are a number of sources of external quality control material. So some of them are listed here, such as CAP, One Word Accuracy, SeroCare, and others that actually have EQA materials for you to use. So because of time, I'm going to go quick here. This is another guideline most recently published on rapid antigen testing. This actually is no longer in press, it's just been released. So just a couple, back in May and June, it's been published. And again, we talk about many parameters and we compare PCR testing with antigen testing and talk about the fact that, of course, antigen testing is not as sensitive as PCR testing. But importantly, we talk about the fact that antigen testing could potentially detect active infection and may actually be better in some cases in assessing the presence of active or live infection that could lead to transmission. So therefore, a positive antigen test may actually indicate that the patient may be infectious and may transmit to others. Whereas positive RNA PCR testing doesn't always, I would say in most cases it does, but in some cases it may be detecting RNA that is not in a live virus, and therefore may not be, the patient may or may not be infectious. So antigen testing does have value, and I would say it can be used in some cases effectively. We talk about how to interpret antigen testing in different scenarios or settings. It's important to look at when the population that you're testing. Is there high pretest probability of a positive result, or is there moderate to low pretest probability? So depending on the probability, interpretation can vary. So usually under high pretest probability, negative results should always be followed by confirmatory PCR test. Whereas in a moderate to low pretest probability, positive results should be followed by PCR testing. So the approach to this and the follow-up does vary depending on the population you're working on. We talk about the many other details that are in the publication. We again, just like serological testing, we talk about importance of analytical validation and clinical validation, and ensuring that there is good validation of clinical sensitivity, clinical specificity, and again, some of the key parameters: analytical, sample type, clinical setting, reference comparator, and of course external quality if available. We talk about some of the interpretation scenarios. So when there is a positive result, usually in a high pretest probability, this usually suggests presence of infection. And as I mentioned, it may indicate the presence of live virus, and therefore a patient that might be infectious to others. Whereas in moderate low pretest probability, the results should be regarded as preliminary and needs to be confirmed. In a negative result case, when the result is negative, if there is high pretest probability, one should try to confirm negativity by doing a PCR test. Whereas in the case where you're testing a population where there's a low probability or a moderate probability of a positive result, therefore you don't really need to repeat or confirm with PCR. You could suggest that the patient is likely negative for any COVID-19 infection. We also talk about a number of other pre-analytical variables as what can actually affect the results and the interpretation of the results. Again, please visit the publication that was published back in April, May of this year. Finally, I wanted to finish by talking about some of the biochemical hematological markers. There are many of them are being used, and we have actually reviewed it against in that publication in 2020. In physiology, we talk about many markers that are used to monitor patients. But I'll move to the next slide where we talk about markers of inflammation. So I mentioned some of the cytokine markers are very commonly used, and in our hospital, for example, we have set up assays for 8 different cytokines: IL-6, TNF-alpha, interferon gamma, and many others, to assess actually our patients who are suspected of being exposed to COVID-19. And in our children's hospital, we also use it in children suspected of MIS-C or multi-inflammatory syndrome in children. So there are a number of other markers: CRP, ferritin, IL-6, ESR, and lymphocyte kind of count that has been used. And typically you see major increases in CRP and ferritin. And ferritin is particularly sensitive and can be increased by many fold after a COVID-19 infection. And there is evidence that actually markers such as IL-6 can actually predict potential
انت بعت له
outcome
لينك مش لازم
in
يكون واصله
patients.
لينك.
So patients who have very high CRP and
اول
increasing
ما
levels
اخلص
of
النجا
CRP
تطلع
during
لايف.
hospitalization
بس انت مش
usually
لازم
do
يكون
not
واصله لينك.
survive,
بعت له
whereas those
بس
who
بعت له
have
قبل
low
يومين.
اللي بعت لي اياه
لا
استنى.
انزل هذا
consistently
دي 3
low
اللي يكون دي
IL-6
2.
levels actually
هي دي 2
do not die, and they tend to survive. So this suggests potential relevance to many of these markers. Somewhat similar results with ferritin, although there was in this study there was a lot of overlap between the two groups. But there are many others. I'm just showing you one or two examples. Other markers, the IL-6 I already mentioned, it's actually been studied. This is another publication in Nature Medicine comparing different patients with IL-6 levels, and again talks about the fact that COVID-19, and this is actually COVID-19 patients, are actually tend to be quite high, and they compare them to CAR-T patients, and showing that basically IL-6 increases quite significant control levels around here. So a major increase in level of cytokines, especially IL-6, is seen in these patients. This is called the cytokine storm, and it's thought to actually contribute to mortality and morbidity. PCT is increased. Procalcitonin, you might ask, why is it increased? Because it's usually sensitive to bacterial infection. But many patients with COVID-19 viral infection also have, on top of that, because of reduced immune function, actually they develop bacterial infection as well. So PCT is seen to be increased as well, and so it's being used in many of these patients. Other markers such as D-dimer, for example, can be used in these patients. Again, D-dimer, a marker of coagulation, is being actually seen to be a very good predictor of outcome. Again, non-survivors have much higher levels of D-dimer than survivors after hospitalization. For sake of time, I'm going to just try to finish. There's a couple more slides left. This is data on hospitalization and cardiac markers. I'm sure many of you know that cardiac troponin is significantly increased in patients after hospitalization with COVID-19, and this is thought to be due to cardiac damage and cardiac failure as detected by measuring BNP. BNP or NT-proBNP are seen to be significantly increased as well. This is just example of one study looking at, but there are many studies looking at troponin. As you can see, those who develop severe disease and were hospitalized have much higher plasma troponin T, and they actually have even higher levels in cases where it led to mortality. There are many other studies supporting this finding. So in summary, there are many markers that can be measured to assess patients during hospitalization, both biochemical markers as well as hematological markers. And I welcome you to visit this article for more detailed. In conclusion, COVID-19 is a major pandemic that is affecting people around the world, and labs around the world have really been at the forefront of this fight against the pandemic. And lab medicine is clearly, this is another example where it's been shown that lab medicine and clinical labs are key drivers of healthcare delivery by providing objective data, so objective laboratory data to clinicians and public health groups and healthcare workers to guide appropriate clinical decision making. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for your kind invitation.
لف الشاشة
لفيتها طيب بدأت شاشة
أشوف.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Alegi, for the wonderful lecture. I want to check if we have questions.
بعرفش أطلع ويعطيني دقيقتين بس وبشوفك هناك برا إذا سمحت دقيقتين بس.
Moving to our second keynote speaker and our second plenary lecture. Here I'm honored to introduce Professor Thomas Osman. She's the visiting lecture program of the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry and Laboratory Medicine. Professor Osman is the president-elect of the European Federation of Clinical Chemistry and Laboratory Medicine. She's a member of the board of the IFCC Foundation for